The Claymore mine was a curved slab of olive drab plastic, 3.5 pounds in weight, with 3 words stamped across its face: front toward enemy. The army had designed it to do one thing: stop massed infantry assaults against fixed defensive lines. In Vietnam, soldiers used it for almost everything except that. They turned it into an ambush weapon, a booby trap, a signaling device, and a rearguard tool for teams fleeing through the jungle, and in doing so they rewrote the purpose of the weapon from the ground up. To make sense of that divergence, it helps to start not in Vietnam, but with the problem the weapon was built to solve. The Claymore was a product of Cold War anxieties, and its design assumptions were written into it years before a single one reached a rice paddy. The origins trace back to the Korean War, where American commanders confronted a tactical problem they found difficult to answer. Chinese and North Korean infantry attacked in large numbers, frequently at night, closing on defensive positions faster than riflemen and machine gunners could cut them down. What defenders needed was a way to throw a wall of projectiles across a wide arc at the precise moment an assault reached close range. The technical answer already existed in principle, in a phenomenon known as the Misnay-Chardin effect, which held that a sheet of explosive detonated against a flat backing throws its force outward rather than in a uniform sphere. Shape the charge, line its face with steel, and the result is a mine that fires in one direction, like a shotgun the size of a book. The man most associated with turning that principle into a fielded weapon was Norman MacLeod, whose work produced the first practical directional fragmentation mines in the 1950s. The Army adopted an early version, then refined it into the M18A1 in 1960. This is worth pausing on, because the date tells you what the weapon was for. The Army of 1960 was preparing above all for a war in Central Europe, where Soviet formations were expected to attack in strength, and a mine that could scythe down advancing infantry fit that scenario precisely. It was a defensive answer to a numerical problem, a way for a smaller force to break up a larger one. When the Claymore reached Vietnam, it arrived carrying the assumptions of the war it was built for. Those assumptions were embedded in the weapon's mechanics. Inside the plastic case sat a layer of C4 explosive, and pressed into its face were 700 steel spheres, each about the size of a small ball bearing. On detonation, the mine hurled those fragments in a 60-degree fan, lethal to roughly 50 meters and dangerous well beyond. The backblast was hazardous in its own right, which is why the manuals demanded at least 16 meters between the firer and the mine. 2 folding sights allowed a soldier to aim it. A pair of scissor legs let him plant it in the dirt. Everything about the design pointed toward a weapon a single infantryman could carry, in place quickly, and fire at short range. The operational parameters were straightforward enough to summarize. The complete mine weighed 3.5 pounds and fit in a bandolier slung over the shoulder. It projected 700 fragments across a 60-degree arc. It was lethal to 50 meters and could cause casualties past 100. And its backblast made the 16 meters behind it a danger zone for the man who triggered it. Detonation, crucially, was meant to be a deliberate act. The standard method was command detonation, using a device that became nearly as recognizable as the mine itself, the M57 firing device, universally called the clacker. Squeezing it produced an electrical pulse that ran down a length of firing wire to the blasting cap. No timer, no pressure plate, no possibility of the mine going off on its own. A soldier watched, waited, and chose the moment. That design choice was not incidental. It reflected a doctrine in which the Claymore was a defensive tool, planted in front of a line, wired back to a foxhole, and fired by a man who could see exactly who was walking into its arc. In the institutional imagination, it was a way to stop a human wave. Vietnam did not oblige the institutional imagination. This is a recurring feature of the American experience in the war, and the Claymore is a clean illustration of it. The massed infantry assault the mine was built to defeat was not the fight most American units encountered on most days. Instead, they patrolled, they set ambushes, they occupied temporary night positions in contested ground, and waited for an enemy who chose the time and place of contact, and who rarely obliged by charging a prepared line. The environment demanded a different way of thinking about a directional mine, and soldiers, being practical, supplied it. The most significant adaptation reversed the weapon's entire purpose, from defense to offense. The Claymore became, above all, an ambush weapon. A patrol settling in along a trail at night would sight several mines to cover the killing zone, wires run back to the men lying in wait. When an enemy column entered the arc, the ambushers fired the mines together, and the fans of steel intersected across the trail. The effect was to open an ambush with the firepower of a dozen shotguns discharged at once, before a single rifle muzzle had flashed to betray an American position. The logic behind this fit neatly into the broader American approach to the ground war. General William Westmoreland, who commanded American forces in Vietnam through the middle years of the conflict, described the objective in familiar terms. Our purpose was to find the enemy, to fix him in position, to fight him, and to finish him. The Claymore could not find the enemy, but once a patrol had, the mine finished a great deal of the fighting in the opening seconds, before the enemy could react or withdraw. In a war where pinning down an elusive opponent was the hardest part of every operation, a weapon that concentrated maximum violence into the brief window of contact was worth a great deal. This helps explain why Claymores became standard issue for ambush patrols across all 4 Corps areas, from the flooded paddies and canals of 4th Corps in the Mekong Delta to the coastal lowlands and the highland jungle. The second major adaptation troubled the chain of command considerably more. Soldiers began rigging Claymores as booby traps, wired to fire on contact rather than on command. A tripwire strung across a trail, connected to the mine's blasting cap, would detonate it the moment an enemy soldier snagged the line. This ran directly counter to doctrine, and in the strictest reading counter to the laws of war as the army understood them, because a victim-operated mine kills whoever trips it, with no human judgment in the loop. The army's official position was unambiguous. Claymores were to be command-detonated, fired by a soldier who could see the target, precisely so that no one triggered one by accident. The reality in the field was less tidy. Under the pressure of holding a night position with too few men to watch every approach, soldiers rigged tripwires, and the practice was common enough that commanders had to keep issuing reminders against it. The gap between what the manual required and what the field did is again a pattern that runs through the whole war. There was a grim practical reason the prohibition kept needing restatement. The enemy had learned to turn the weapon around, literally. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers understood the Claymore well, and a favored technique was to crawl up to an American night position in the dark and quietly reverse the mines, converting that helpful printed instruction into a death sentence for the men who would fire them. Alternatively, they simply stole the mine, or disconnected the firing wire and rerouted it to a cap of their own. This vulnerability was the direct consequence of a design virtue. The Claymore was built to be simple enough that a soldier could emplace it by feel, in the dark, under stress. That same simplicity meant an enemy could relocate or reverse it just as easily. There was no lock, no code, nothing to slow anyone who reached the mine. What made the weapon usable made it stealable, and the two qualities could not be separated. Experienced units adapted by keeping emplaced mines under constant observation, noting the exact position of each so any change could be spotted, and sometimes booby-trapping the Claymores themselves so that tampering triggered a separate charge. The weapon meant to secure a perimeter had become one more thing that had to be secured. The captured Claymore grew into a genuine operational problem. Enemy forces used them in their own ambushes against American and South Vietnamese patrols, and North Vietnam eventually produced copies, some manufactured in the Soviet bloc, others improvised in jungle workshops. The directional mine invented to stop communist infantry was now being fired back at the men who had brought it to the war. South Vietnamese forces relied on the Claymore as heavily as the Americans, and their experience deserves the same scrutiny. Army of the Republic of Vietnam Infantry, regional and popular forces, and the elite ranger and airborne units all used the mine for ambushes and perimeter defense. Where South Vietnamese units were well trained and well led, they used it to good effect. Where they were not, the familiar problems appeared. Mines left unobserved, mines reversed by infiltrators, mines lost to theft. The weapon rewarded discipline and punished its absence, regardless of whose hands held the clacker. To understand why these adaptations took hold so completely, consider the environment the typical American patrol operated in. The terrain favored the ambusher and frustrated the defender. In triple canopy jungle, visibility could fall to a few meters. Trails were often the only reliable avenues of movement, which made them the natural site of contact. Night belonged to whoever prepared for it best, and the enemy fought in brief, violent, small-scale engagements rather than the massed assaults the Claymore was designed to break. In that setting, a lightweight directional mine a rifleman could carry and sight himself was worth more as an instrument of ambush than as a fixture of defense. Portability drove much of that versatility. A rifle company moving through the bush could not haul heavy defensive stores, but every soldier could carry a claymore or two in the standard bandolier, along with wire and clacker. When the company halted for the night, the mines went out in a ring covering the gaps between positions. This remained the doctrinal use, and it stayed important. Around fixed installations, firebases and night defensive positions, claymores formed one layer of defense alongside wire, trip flares and pre-registered artillery. At the large fixed bases, the defensive role reached its fullest expression. Fire bases across South Vietnam ringed their perimeters with banks of mines, sometimes hundreds, wired to central firing points in the bunkers. During a ground assault, defenders could fire them in sequence or all at once, sweeping the approaches with steel as attackers left the cover of the tree line. Here, the weapon did exactly what its designers intended, and did it well. The point is only that this was one use among many, and not the most common one in daily operations. Soldiers found further uses the manuals never anticipated. Some elevated claymores on stakes or in trees to alter the fragment pattern and catch an enemy who might otherwise drop beneath the arc. Others daisy-chained several mines with detonating cords so a single squeeze fired them all, widening the wall of steel. In the delta, mines were sited to cover canal banks and crossing points, adapting a land weapon to a landscape of water. Each was a local solution, worked out in the field and passed along by word of mouth rather than by manual. There was also a quieter application that rarely reaches the histories. A single mine covering a likely infiltration route, wired to a man on watch, let a small element dominate ground it could not physically occupy. Firing a claymore also served as an unambiguous signal to the rest of a unit that contact had begun and where. Its psychological effect on an enemy caught in the arc, and on the survivors who had to keep advancing through it, was considerable, though harder to quantify than a casualty figure. The killing power, by contrast, was easy enough to measure, and it explains the weapon's popularity. Against troops caught in the open within the arc, a claymore produced catastrophic results in a fraction of a second. 700 fragments across a 60-degree fan meant that anyone in the killing zone had almost no chance of avoiding several hits. In ambush after ambush, the opening detonation of massed claymores accounted for the majority of enemy casualties before the small arms even opened up. The mine did the work of a whole squad's sustained fire, compressed into the first instant of contact. That lethality made it indispensable to the reconnaissance units operating in the smallest teams, who could least afford a prolonged firefight. Long-range reconnaissance patrols, the LRPs, and the Special Forces led teams of the Studies and Observation Group depended on the mine to break contact when a small team was compromised deep in enemy territory. A team under pursuit could leave a claymore covering its back trail, command detonated from cover or rigged to a tripwire, buying the seconds it needed to move. The weapon let a handful of men impose a heavy cost on a much larger pursuing force. The technique was formalized in what became known as the mechanical ambush, a claymore or bank of them wired to a battery and switch, positioned over a trail, and left to fire when a target broke the circuit. Functionally, this was a booby trap, and it sat squarely in the legal and moral gray zone the command directives worried about. For units operating where friendly troops and civilians were known to be absent, it let a small force cover far more ground than it could physically watch. Some units used it extensively, others banned it outright. That split captures the central tension of the Claymore's Vietnam career. The weapon's greatest strength that one man could sight it and leave it to deliver a devastating blow was inseparable from its greatest liability, that a mine left to fire on its own cannot tell who trips it. Command detonation solved the problem in principle by keeping a human in the loop. In practice, too much ground and too few men pushed soldiers toward the victim-operated methods the manuals forbade. The doctrine and the field were, on this point, permanently at odds. The broader context of enemy mine warfare made the stakes concrete. Mines and booby traps, of which the reversed Claymore was one variety, accounted for a substantial share of American casualties in Vietnam, by some estimates well over 10% of those killed and wounded, and considerably more in certain areas and periods. The precise figures are debated, and different commands counted differently, but the general picture is not in dispute. A significant portion of American losses came not from stand-up battles, but from devices, including captured and copied claymores, that killed with no enemy soldier present to pull a trigger. That reality tightened how American units handled the weapon over time. Accountability increased as commands recognized that every mine lost or captured could be turned against friendly forces. Units were expected to recover emplaced mines when they moved, account for every one issued, and guard against theft from night positions. This proved easier to order than to do. In the confusion of a night move or the aftermath of a firefight, mines were left behind, and some inevitably reached enemy hands. The portability that made the weapon so useful also made it easy to lose. By the later years of the war, the Claymore had settled into a set of roles that would outlast Vietnam entirely. It was the primary casualty-producing weapon in the opening seconds of a well-laid ambush. It was a component of perimeter defense at every level, from the two-man position to the battalion fire base. It was a tool for small reconnaissance teams to break contact and cover their movement. And despite official disapproval, it remained an improvised booby trap wherever units judged the benefit worth the risk. Its influence reached into how the Army thought about firepower at the small unit level. The Claymore gave a squad a way to concentrate lethal force at a chosen point and moment without waiting on artillery, air support, or sustained rifle fire, all of which took time and gave away position. For a war of fleeting contacts fought by small units far from immediate support, that was a real asset. The mine packed a great deal of killing power into something one man could carry, emplace, and fire. The pattern of its use reveals something about the character of the war itself. A conflict of massed set-piece battles would have employed the Claymore mostly as intended, ringing defensive lines against assault. Vietnam used it instead as an instrument of the small, dispersed, initiative-seizing actions that defined the ground war for American infantry. The weapon adapted because the men carrying it were fighting a war of patrols and ambushes, not a war of fronts. In that sense, its career is a compact record of how the war was actually fought, as against how it had been imagined. It is worth being precise about the weapon's limits. The Claymore won no engagements on its own, and it solved none of the strategic problems that beset American forces in Vietnam. It was a tactical tool, lethal within its arc, and useless outside it. It could devastate a column caught in a killing zone and do nothing at all about an enemy who declined to enter one. Like much of the sophisticated equipment the United States brought to the war, it performed its narrow function well while the larger contest turned on factors no directional mind could reach. What the weapon illustrates most clearly is how thoroughly soldiers reshape their equipment to fit the war in front of them. The designers built a defensive mine to stop human wave assaults. The men who carried it built an ambush weapon, a booby trap, a rear guard covering device, and a perimeter fixture, all from the same 3.5 pounds of plastic and steel. Doctrine followed practice rather than the reverse, catching up to what the troops had already worked out in the paddies and the jungle. The design proved sound enough to require almost no fundamental change. The M18A1 carried in the last years of the war was, in its essentials, the same mine adopted in 1960, and it stayed in service for decades afterward with its printed instruction unaltered. Few weapons of that era survived so long with so little modification. The reason is not complicated. The device did a simple thing reliably. and it left the judgment of when and how to use it entirely to the soldier holding the clacker. The experience fed back into how the army trained afterward. The techniques worked out in Vietnam, the ambush sighting, the daisy chain, the disciplined recovery of emplaced mines, the constant watch against tampering, became standard instruction rather than field improvisation. The mechanical ambush and the tripwire booby trap remained officially discouraged, but the command-detonated ambush role that Vietnam had established was written firmly into doctrine. A mine that entered the war as a defensive afterthought left it as a recognized offensive tool, its purpose inverted by a decade of practical use. The most consequential decisions about the Claymore were never made in the ordnance laboratories or the doctrine schools. They were made by riflemen deciding where to place a mine along a trail at nightfall, by the men who reversed those mines in the dark, and by the commanders who kept issuing directives the field kept quietly ignoring. A weapon is only ever as defensive or offensive as the hands that hold it, and in Vietnam those hands found uses for the Claymore that its inventors never thought to write down.